The road to the mountains had been longer than memory suggested, though perhaps that was merely age speaking through his bones. Our Bell founder, let us not burden him with a name, for he could be any master of that dying craft, shifted his weight on the mule cart's hard bench and considered the changing landscape of 1853. Spain was transforming itself, slowly and painfully, like metal cooling in a mold that didn't quite fit. 3 days out from Santander, the Cantabrian peaks rose before him like the shoulders of sleeping giants, their slopes scarred here and there by abandoned Carlist fortifications. The war had ended officially some 4 years past, but its ghosts lingered in burnt church towers and suspicious glances between travelers. He had cast bells for both sides during those years. What did bronze care for politics, though he kept such thoughts buried deeper than any bell's foundation? The mule knew these paths better than its temporary master. Each switchback revealed new valleys folded into green shadows, villages clinging to hillsides like barnacles to ship hulls. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, hopeful lines. In one hamlet, he glimpsed workers laying iron rails for the new northern railway that would, they said, connect Santander to Madrid within the decade. Progress, they called it, though he wondered what would become of muleteers and cart makers when steam engines ruled the roads. "You're thinking heavy thoughts for such a morning," came a voice from behind. The founder turned to see another traveler catching up on foot, a merchant by his dress with the kind of worn boots that spoke of countless leagues traveled. The man's face held that particular weathering that came from years of sun and rain on mountain paths, and his smile revealed a gold tooth that caught the morning light. "Joaquin!" The recognition came with genuine pleasure. "What brings you to these heights?" "The same as always. Wool from the highland farms bound for the coast. And you? Still pouring your soul into bronze?" They fell into the easy rhythm of old acquaintances reunited by chance. Joaquin tied his pack-horse to the cart and walked alongside, sharing gossip from a dozen towns. The founder learned that wheat prices had risen again, that the Queen's mother was meddling in politics as usual, that bandits had been seen near Potes but were probably just hungry farmers in disguise. "Where are you bound with all that equipment?" Joaquin gestured at the cart's cargo. Wooden forms, measuring tools, samples of bronze for comparison, the specialized hammers that could read a bell's health through sound alone. "The Mendoza estate, past San Vicente. They've commissioned me to inspect bells in 6 villages." Joaquin's expression shifted, like a cloud passing over the sun. "Ah, Don Rodrigo's domain. You'll find interesting work there, no doubt." They say strange things about that place, especially about the old chapel bell. The founder's professional interest sharpened. "Strange? In what way?" "It rings when it shouldn't. During storms, with no hand upon the rope. The locals cross themselves when they speak of it." Joaquin lowered his voice, though they were alone on the road. "Some say it's God's own voice. Others whisper darker theories. Either way, it's made Don Rodrigo even more particular than usual." The founder had met enough of Spain's rural nobility to understand that particular was a generous term. These men, caught between their medieval privileges and modern pressures, often developed eccentricities that their wealth allowed them to indulge. Still, a bell that rang itself, now that was worth investigating, even if the explanation proved mundane. They parted ways at a crossroads near midday, Joaquin heading west while the founder continued south. The landscape grew wilder as afternoon progressed, cultivated fields giving way to oak forests and meadows where half-wild cattle grazed. The air itself changed, growing thinner and cleaner, carrying the scent of wild thyme and distant rain. As evening approached, the road crested a final ridge, and there it spread before him. The Mendoza estate, larger than most villages, a small kingdom unto itself. The main house rose 3 stories, its stone walls the color of old bone in the fading light. Outbuildings clustered around it like children seeking protection, and beyond them, fields and pastures stretched to meet the forest's edge. But what caught his eye was the chapel, set apart on a small hill. Even from this distance, he could see its partial ruin. The roof had collapsed on one side, leaving walls open to the sky. And there, just visible in the bell tower, hung a shadow that must be the mysterious bell itself. The mule, sensing journey's end and the promise of stable and feed, picked up its pace without encouragement. The founder let the reins go slack, his mind already turning over possibilities. In 42 years of life, 30 of them working bronze, he had encountered supposed miracles before. Usually they dissolved under scrutiny like morning mist, leaving only human hopes and fears behind. Yet as they descended toward the estate, with the first stars appearing in a deepening sky, he felt that particular tingling that came before interesting work, the same sensation he'd had as a young apprentice when his master had first let him pour molten bronze into a bell mold. Some mysteries were worth solving, not to destroy wonder, but to understand it better. The estate's dogs began barking as he approached the main gate, their voices carrying across the valley. Windows glowed with lamplight, and he could smell bread baking, wood smoke, and that indefinable scent of prosperity. Well-fed animals, clean straw, freshly laundered cloth. Whatever else Don Rodrigo might be, he ran an orderly estate. A young man emerged from the gatehouse holding a lantern high. "You're expected, Master Founder. Don Rodrigo asks that you join him for dinner once you've settled." As the gates opened and he entered this small, self-contained world, the founder glanced once more at the ruined chapel. The bell hung motionless in its tower, a dark shape against darker sky. But for just a moment, he could have sworn he saw a faint blue flickering around its edges, like foxfire on a ship's rigging. Trick of tired eyes, surely. Nothing more. Don Rodrigo de Mendoza proved to be exactly what the founder had expected, and yet not quite. The nobleman received him in a study lined with leather-bound books that looked more decorative than read, their spines catching candlelight like rows of silent witnesses. At 58, Don Rodrigo carried himself with the careful dignity of a man who knew his world was shifting beneath his feet, but refused to acknowledge the movement. "You come highly recommended," the Don said, pouring wine from a crystal decanter. "The Bishop of Santander speaks well of your work on the cathedral bells." The founder accepted the wine, good Rioja, probably worth more than he earned in a week, and waited. Men like Don Rodrigo never summoned craftsmen for simple inspections. There was always something more. 6 villages, 6 churches, 12 bells in total, Don Rodrigo continued, unfolding a map across his desk. "Some date back 3 centuries. We need to know their condition before the bishop's visit in August." Ah, there it was, episcopal politics. The founder nodded, studying the map while his mind calculated time and distances. 2 months' work, perhaps 3 if complications arose. But Don Rodrigo wasn't finished. "There is also a 7th bell." The nobleman's voice dropped, gaining a peculiar intensity. "In our old chapel of San Isidro, it is special." The founder kept his expression neutral, though his pulse quickened. "Special in what way, my lord?" "It speaks when God wills it." Don Rodrigo crossed himself reflexively. 3 weeks ago, during the last great storm, it rang once. A single, perfect note that carried across the entire valley. Within the hour, my nephew recovered from a fever that had gripped him for days. The founder had heard variations of this story 1,000 times. Correlation dressed up as causation, coincidence elevated to miracle. Yet something in Don Rodrigo's manner suggested more than simple superstition. Has it always behaved thus? The records are incomplete, but yes, throughout living memory. My grandfather documented 17 instances, always during storms, always a single ring, always followed by significant events. After dinner, roasted lamb with rosemary, bread still warm from the ovens, a servant led the founder to his quarters above the estate's workshop. The room was simple but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a writing desk, and a window overlooking the chapel hill. He stood there for a long moment, watching clouds gather across stars, feeling the air pressure drop like a stone in water. Morning came gray and close, with the smell of rain pending. The founder broke his fast with the household staff in the kitchen, listening to their chatter while studying their faces. The cook, a stout woman named Carmen, crossed herself when someone mentioned the chapel bell. The stable boys exchanged knowing looks. Only the head housekeeper, a composed woman named Lucia, seemed unbothered by the topic. "You'll want to see it before the rain comes," she said, handing him a basket of provisions. "The path gets treacherous when wet." She was younger than he'd expected for such a position, perhaps 28, with intelligent, dark eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. Her hands, he noticed, bore small ink stains on the fingers, unusual for a housekeeper. The climb to the chapel took 20 minutes through overgrown gardens that had once been formal, now surrendered to wild roses and creeping thyme. The building itself was older than the main house, its Romanesque arches speaking of the 12th or 13th century. The partial roof collapse had occurred decades ago, judging by the vegetation growing through the rubble, but the bell tower stood intact, and within it, the founder stood very still, his trained eye taking in every detail. The bell was magnificent, even in its damaged state. Perhaps 4 feet across at the mouth, cast in bronze that had aged to a deep green-gold patina. The crack ran from rim to crown, not straight, but following a strange, serpentine pattern that seemed almost deliberate. He climbed the worn stone steps to the bell chamber, each footfall echoing in the confined space. Up close, the bell's surface revealed elaborate decorations, Latin inscriptions intertwined with symbols he didn't immediately recognize. The date was clear enough, 1621. But the maker's mark had been deliberately obscured, scratched out with something sharp. Setting down his tools, he began his examination properly. The bronze alloy felt different under his practiced hands, denser than standard, with an unusual smoothness. He tapped gently with his smallest hammer, listening to the response. The sound was wrong. Not dead, as cracked bells usually were, but somehow expectant, as if the metal were holding its breath. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Father Tomas stood in the doorway, slightly winded from the climb. At 71, the priest moved with the careful deliberation of age, but his eyes remained sharp as a crow's. "Unusual, certainly," the founder replied, running his fingers along the crack's edge. "This damage pattern. I've never seen its like." It happened in 1798 during a particularly fierce storm. Lightning struck the tower directly. The bell ringer died instantly, poor soul. Father Tomas approached slowly, one hand on the wall for support. "Since then, it rings only as God wills." The founder noticed something else. Tiny holes drilled into the bell's crown, filled now with some kind of resin. Modification work, but why? He filed the observation away. "You have records from the casting?" "Some. The church archives hold payment ledgers, correspondence. The bell was commissioned by Don Rodrigo's ancestor after a tragedy. His son was struck by lightning in this very spot. They say he wanted a bell that would ward off God's wrath." Interesting. A bell commissioned in response to lightning, damaged by lightning, that now rang during lightning. The pattern was too neat to be entirely coincidental. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and both men glanced toward the open wall where clouds massed like an army preparing for assault. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing against the skin with electric potential. "I should return to the house," Father Tomas said, but his eyes remained fixed on the bell. "If you're still here when the storm breaks, I'll take shelter," the founder assured him, though privately he had no such intention. If this bell truly rang during storms, he needed to observe it directly. After the priest departed, the founder continued his examination with increased urgency. The metal composition was definitely non-standard. He detected traces of silver in the alloy, possibly antimony as well. Such additions would alter the bell's resonance characteristics dramatically. And that crack, he traced it again with one finger. It had turned the entire bell into a vast, resonating chamber, like the sound box of a guitar. The first fat raindrops began to fall, striking the exposed floor with dull splats. The founder gathered his tools but remained in the tower, positioning himself where he could observe while staying relatively dry. The storm was building quickly now, wind driving rain in sheets across the valley. Then he saw it, a faint blue glow beginning to form around the bell's surface, barely visible but unmistakably present. The hair on his arms stood on end. The very air tasted of copper and anticipation. Lightning forked across the sky, brilliant and terrible. The thunder followed almost instantly, shaking the ancient stones. And in that moment between flash and sound, the bell emitted a single, pure note that seemed to emerge from the very fabric of reality itself. Not struck, but sung. A voice of bronze and storm, and something ineffably other. The founders stood transfixed as the note hung in the air far longer than physics should allow, eventually fading like the last light of sunset. His mind raced through possibilities, each more intriguing than the last. This wasn't miracle or magic. It was something far more interesting. It was a puzzle waiting to be solved. The founders' work on the village bells began 3 days after the storm, once the roads had dried enough for travel. Each church told its own story through bronze. A cracked treble in San Pedro that spoke of decades of enthusiastic but unskilled ringing. A tenor in Santa Maria whose tone had sweetened with age like wine in oak casks. He moved methodically, making notes in his leather journal, with the precise hand of someone who understood that memory could betray even the most careful craftsman. It was in the third village, while examining a particularly fine bell cast in 1542, that Lucia found him. She arrived on horseback, riding astride like a man despite her skirts, carrying a basket of provisions from the estate kitchen. "Don Rodrigo thought you might appreciate a proper meal," she said, dismounting with practiced ease. They sat in the churchyard among weathered headstones, sharing bread and cheese, while swallows darted overhead. The founder noticed how she held her portion delicately, her fingers avoiding the food directly, the habits of someone who handled books and valued clean hands. "You read," he observed, not quite making it a question. Her dark eyes flashed with something between defiance and amusement. "Is it so obvious?" "Ink stains are difficult to hide. Also, you hold bread the way scholars do, carefully, as if it might smudge." She laughed then, a sound as clear as any bell. "My father was the estate manager before me. He believed education shouldn't be limited by one's birth or sex. Don Rodrigo tortates it because I keep superior accounts." The founder thought of his own son back in Santander, apprenticing in the trade, but showing more interest in the new engineering texts arriving from France. Change was coming to Spain, whether the nobility acknowledged it or not, carried in ink-stained fingers and foreign books. "The chapel bell interests you," Lucia continued, studying his face. "You spent 3 hours there yesterday evening." He had indeed returned to the chapel, taking measurements and making sketches by lamplight. The blue glow hadn't reappeared, but he'd discovered more oddities, metal filings embedded in the wooden beam above the bell, as if something magnetic had drawn them there. Scorch marks on the stone that followed no natural pattern. "Have you known it long, the bell?" "All my life. My father used to say it was like a barometer. It could sense storms before clouds gathered. He kept records, you know, not just of when it rang, but of weather conditions, wind directions, even the phases of the moon." The founder's pulse quickened. "These records, they still exist?" "In his old study. Don Rodrigo had it sealed after father died, but I have a key." She paused, seeming to weigh risks. "I could show you, if you're discreet." That evening, while the household attended vespers, Lucia led him through servants' corridors to a small room that smelled of dust and old paper. Journals lined the shelves, each marked with years in a careful hand. The founder pulled out one from 1798, the year of the lightning strike. The entries were meticulous. Lucia's father had documented not just the bell's ringing, but everything surrounding it. Atmospheric pressure changes, animal behavior, even the taste of the air. One passage caught the founder's attention. "The 3rd day of July, the bell ringer, Francisco, reported strange dreams again. Says he hears the bell calling to him during storms. I've noticed he's taken to wearing copper rings on every finger. Claims they protect him. The metal seems to tarnish unusually fast in the bell tower." "Francisco was the one killed by lightning," Lucia said softly, reading over his shoulder. "Father wrote that they found him fused to the bell rope. His copper rings melted into his flesh." The founder turned pages, absorbing details. Multiple bell ringers over the years had reported similar experiences. Strange dreams, compulsions to be near the bell during storms, unexplained illnesses that seemed to improve after the bell rang. It painted a picture of something that transcended simple superstition. A door slammed elsewhere in the house, making them both start. Lucia quickly returned the journal to its place. "We should go. Don Rodrigo has returned early." Over the following days, the founder continued his official work, while his mind churned over the mystery. He was measuring bells in the 4th village when Miguel, the estate's young blacksmith, sought him out. At 19, Miguel had the broad shoulders of his trade, but the quick eyes of someone who thought beyond mere metalwork. "They say you're the best bell founder in the North," Miguel said without preamble. "Is it true you cast the great bell of Burgos Cathedral?" "I assisted my master in that work, yes." The founder continued his measurements, but he could sense the young man had more on his mind than professional admiration. "I've been thinking about the chapel bell. The way it rings without being struck. Could it be some kind of resonance? Like when a singer can shatter glass with the right note?" "Clever boy." The founder set down his tools and gave Miguel his full attention. "What makes you think of resonance?" "I've noticed things. During storms, all the metal in the chapel vibrates. I've left tools there and found them moved afterward. And there's this." Miguel pulled out a piece of paper covered with crude but thoughtful diagrams. "I mapped where lightning has struck the estate over the past 10 years. It's always within 50 meters of the chapel, never farther." The founder studied the map with growing excitement. The pattern was undeniable. The chapel acted as a lightning attractor. But why? And how did that relate to the bell's mysterious ringing? "There's something else," Miguel said, lowering his voice. "Don Rodrigo has been meeting with the other landowners. They're planning to use the next miracle as justification to reclaim common lands from the villages. Says God's voice speaking through the bell proves divine approval." Politics and bronze, an unfortunate mixture. The founder had seen such manipulation before, human greed dressed in religious cloth. But this added urgency to his investigation. If the bell's mystery could be explained naturally, it might prevent Don Rodrigo from exploiting superstition for gain. Father Tomas appeared at the church door, moving slowly but purposefully toward them. The old priest's face showed the strain of some internal struggle. "I've been praying on whether to speak with you," he said to the founder. "There are things about the bell that aren't in any official record." They walked together through the village cemetery as Father Tomas unburdened himself. "In 1798, before the lightning strike, there was an attempt to silence the bell permanently. Someone, we never discovered who, tried to fill the crack with lead. Francisco, the bell ringer, discovered it during routine maintenance and removed the lead before anyone else knew. Why would someone want to silence it? Because even then, there were those who suspected the bell's ringing wasn't entirely divine. A group of learned men from the University of Oviedo had visited, taken measurements, spoken of electrical fluid and atmospheric condensation. The local bishop ordered their findings destroyed, but whispers remained. The founder felt pieces clicking together in his mind, like tumblers in a lock. A bell designed or modified to interact with atmospheric electricity, knowledge of that interaction suppressed, and now a nobleman ready to exploit the ignorance that suppression had created. "Father, do you believe the bell's ringing is miraculous?" The old priest was quiet for a long moment, watching clouds gather on the horizon. Another storm approaching, perhaps days away. "I believe God works through natural law as readily as through suspension of it. If the bell rings through some principle we don't yet understand, does that make it less wondrous? Does understanding the rainbow diminish its beauty?" It was a more sophisticated theology than the founder had expected from a rural priest. But then, Spain was full of surprises, educated men in unexpected places, thoughts that ran deeper than the surface suggested. As they parted, Father Tomas gripped his arm with surprising strength. "Whatever you discover, be careful how you reveal it. Truth can be as dangerous as any lie, depending on who wields it." Walking back to the estate as evening fell, the founder reflected on all he'd learned. The bell was a puzzle of many pieces: metallurgy, meteorology, human ambition, and faith, all intertwined like the Latin inscriptions on its surface. Solving it would require not just technical knowledge, but wisdom about human nature. The estate glowed with lamplight as he approached, a small island of illumination against the darkening mountains. Somewhere in that light, Don Rodrigo was planning his exploitation of the miraculous. Somewhere, too, Lucia was, perhaps, teaching a servant child to read by candlelight, and Miguel was dreaming of innovations beyond the traditional forge. The monastery of San Salvador, perched on its mountainside like a bird of prey, all stone and silence against the morning sky. The founder had ridden out before dawn, following Father Tomas's directions to this repository of regional church records. The prior, a thin man with ink-stained fingers much like Lucia's, led him through corridors that smelled of beeswax and centuries. 1621, you say? A peculiar year for commissions. The prior pulled a leather-bound ledger from a shelf that required a ladder to reach. The Flemish were casting magnificent bells then, but few Spanish nobles could afford their services. The founder watched dust motes dance in the slanted light from high windows while the prior searched. These monasteries were Spain's memory, holding records that royal libraries had forgotten existed. Here, in careful Latin and fading ink, lay the skeleton of history. Ah, here we are. A payment to one Meister Jan van der Hoeven of Mechelen for the casting of one bell for the chapel of San Isidro, Mendoza estate. The prior adjusted his spectacles, squinting at the tiny script. The amount is substantial, 3 times the usual rate. Does it say why such expense? There's a note in the margin, pro speciale composizione et forma, for special composition and form. And here, the prior's finger traced down the page, additional payment for materiis rarioribus, rare materials. The founder copied the entries carefully into his journal. A Flemish master, working with unusual materials and charging triple rate. This was no ordinary chapel bell. The Flemish were known for their innovations in bronze casting, their willingness to experiment where Spanish founders held to tradition. There's correspondence, too, the prior said, producing another volume. The commissioning letter from Don Felipe de Mendoza. He writes of wanting a bell that will speak with heaven's own voice, that will turn away God's wrath as Moses turned away serpents. A bell designed to interact with lightning. The implication was becoming clearer. The founder thought of those tiny holes in the bell's crown, the unusual alloy, the serpentine crack that seemed too perfect to be accidental damage. Riding back toward the estate, he noticed the quality of light changing, taking on that greenish tinge that preceded major storms. His mule grew skittish, ears flicking at sounds beyond human hearing. In the fields, farmers worked with increased urgency, bringing in what hay they could before rain came. The main house bustled with different preparations when he arrived. Servants secured shutters, brought in garden furniture, covered the well. But there was something else, a tension that had nothing to do with weather. He found Lucia directing the work, her usually composed face showing strain. "Doña Isabel has arrived from Madrid," she explained quietly. "Don Rodrigo's sister. She brings complications." The founder had heard of Doña Isabel, educated in France, widow of a liberal politician, known for her salon in Madrid, where dangerous ideas were discussed behind closed doors. Her presence here, now, seemed hardly coincidental. He encountered her that evening in the library, a handsome woman of 52, with silver threading through still dark hair. She stood before a shelf of scientific texts, holding a volume he recognized, Franklin's Experiments with Electricity, translated into French. "You're the Bell founder," she said without turning. "My brother speaks of you with irritation, which means you're not simply agreeing with everything he says." "I observe and measure, Signora. Agreement or disagreement comes after understanding." She turned then, studying him with intelligent eyes. "An empiricist? How refreshing. Tell me, what do you make of our miraculous bell?" The founder chose his words carefully. This woman could be ally or enemy, depending on her loyalties. "I think it's a masterwork of both craft and natural philosophy, though perhaps not in the way most believe." "Carefully said. You should know that I've corresponded with scientists in Paris about electrical phenomena." "What you're investigating here isn't unknown to modern science, merely to rural superstition." She pulled a letter from the book she held, handing it to him. The French was beyond his complete comprehension, but he recognized diagrams, electrical circuits, descriptions of Leyden jars, theories about atmospheric electrical accumulation. "Lightning seeks the easiest path to ground," Doña Isabel continued. "A bronze bell, particularly one with certain metallic properties, connected to wet bell ropes that run to earth, it becomes what the French call a paratonnerre, a lightning rod. But the ringing without being struck? Ah, that's the elegant part. Have you noticed the bell's crack pattern? It's not random. I believe someone, perhaps that Flemish master, understood that the right crack could turn the entire bell into a resonating chamber. When electrical discharge passes through it, the metal itself vibrates. The founder felt the satisfaction of hypothesis confirmed by independent observation. Yet knowing the mechanism and proving it were different matters, especially with Don Rodrigo's plans depending on continued mystery. "Your brother intends to use the bell's next miracle for political purposes." "Of course he does. Rodrigo has always confused divine providence with personal advantage." Her tone held old sibling frustration. "But perhaps science can provide what prayer cannot, a resolution that serves truth without destroying faith." Thunder rolled across the valley, still distant but approaching with inevitable purpose. Through the library windows, they could see servants hurrying to complete their preparations. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing against the glass like something alive. "The storm will be here by tonight," Doña Isabel observed. "Rodrigo is already planning his performance. He'll gather the household in the great hall, lead prayers, and wait for the bell to ring. When it does, he'll proclaim it as divine endorsement of his land claims." "Unless the bell doesn't ring," she smiled, sharp as a blade. "Or unless someone explains why it rings. But carefully. Destroy too much faith too quickly, and people break. My late husband learned that lesson politically." Miguel appeared at the library door, breathing hard from running. "Señor, Don Rodrigo requests your presence. He wishes to know if the chapel bell is ready for inspection." Interesting phrasing. The founder exchanged glances with Doña Isabel, who nodded slightly. "Go, see what my brother wants." He found Don Rodrigo in his study with two other men, local landowners by their dress, faces showing the particular combination of greed and righteousness that made for dangerous politics. A map lay spread on the desk, marked with property boundaries and disputed territories. "Ah, our expert," Don Rodrigo said with false warmth. "These gentlemen are curious about your professional opinion of our miraculous bell." I haven't completed my examination, my lord. But surely you've formed impressions. Is it not true that such a bell, ringing of its own accord during storms, defies natural explanation? The founder felt the trap in the question. Agree, and he became complicit in their scheme. Disagree, and he might find his employment terminated before he could find proof. I've found that God often works through natural law in ways that seem miraculous to those who don't understand the principles involved, he said carefully. The bell is certainly extraordinary. One of the landowners, a florid man with overfed jowls, leaned forward. But you're not saying it's a trick. I'm saying that mystery and mechanism aren't mutually exclusive. A rainbow operates on precise optical principles, yet it still signified God's covenant to Noah. Don Rodrigo's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, a servant entered. My lords, the storm approaches rapidly. Perhaps you should take shelter in the main hall. As they filed out, Don Rodrigo gripped the founder's arm. I trust you understand the importance of tonight. The bell will ring. It always does with storms of this magnitude. When it does, your role is to confirm its miraculous nature. My role is to speak truth, my lord. Truth is what men of standing say it is. Remember that. But the founder was already thinking ahead to the storm, to the bell waiting in its ruined chapel, to the dance of lightning and bronze that would soon begin. Truth had its own voice, he'd learned over the years. The great hall filled with bodies and nervous energy as the storm approached. Don Rodrigo had orchestrated the gathering carefully. Household staff, visiting landowners, even villagers who'd sought shelter from the tempest. They clustered in groups defined by station, yet united in their upward glances toward the ceiling beams that creaked under the wind's assault. The founder positioned himself near a window where he could observe both the crowd and the chapel hill beyond. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the landscape in stark, momentary revelations. Each flash showed the bell tower standing defiant against the turbulent sky, waiting. It will ring soon, an old servant woman murmured, clutching her rosary. It always knows when we need a sign. Don Rodrigo stood before the great fireplace, affecting a pose of devotional contemplation that reminded the founder of paintings he'd seen of saints awaiting divine revelation. The other landowners flanked him, their faces attempting similar piety while their eyes betrayed more earthly calculations. Lucia moved through the crowd with wine and water, her expression carefully neutral. When she passed the founder, she whispered, I've hidden my father's journals. Whatever happens tonight, they'll survive. Smart girl. The founder had his own precautions, detailed sketches and measurements tucked safely in his room, copies already sent with a trusted messenger to his colleague in Santander. Knowledge, once preserved, was hard to destroy completely. Father Tomas led the assembly in prayer, his aged voice somehow carrying over the wind's howling. Yet the founder noticed the priest's eyes kept drifting to the windows, watching the storm with something closer to natural philosophy than religious fervor. The first lightning strike hit the estate's outer wall, the thunder so immediate that several people cried out. Don Rodrigo raised his arms dramatically. Be not afraid! God speaks to the faithful! But the founder was watching the chapel, and what he saw made his breath catch. The bell tower was glowing, not with reflected lightning, but with its own blue-white luminescence, as if the very air around it had become charged with potential. He'd read about such phenomena in sailors' accounts. St. Elmo's fire, they called it. But to see it concentrated around bronze and stone was extraordinary. Miguel appeared at his elbow, eyes wide with excitement rather than fear. "The metal filings I left near the bell yesterday. They're standing on end like tiny soldiers. I saw them just before the storm broke." Another flash, closer still, and in its aftermath the founder glimpsed something remarkable. Doña Isabel stood near another window, holding what appeared to be a compass. Its needle spun wildly, pointing not north but toward the chapel. The air in the hall grew thick, oppressive. Hair stood on end, and the founder tasted copper on his tongue. Everyone felt it, that sensation of standing at the edge of something immense about to happen. Even Don Rodrigo's practiced composure showed cracks of genuine awe. Then it came, not the lightning they expected, but something more profound. The bell rang. The note emerged from the storm itself, pure and impossible, a sound that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the bones. It held for longer than any struck bell could sustain, wavering slightly as if the very air were singing. In that moment, the founder understood why people believed it miraculous. The sound contained something beyond mere acoustics. It was the voice of forces larger than human comprehension, made manifest in bronze. "Behold!" Don Rodrigo cried, seizing his moment. "Heaven itself speaks. As the bell rings, so God endorses our righteous claim to the land stolen by those who would deny traditional order." But even as the nobleman spoke, the founder noticed something crucial. The bell's note was fading, yes, but in a pattern, regular pulses, almost like a heartbeat. And with each pulse, the blue glow around the tower flickered in synchronization. This wasn't random discharge, but something more structured, more designed. "It's beautiful," Lucia said softly beside him. And he realized she too was watching the pattern rather than the performance. Don Rodrigo was building to his political crescendo when the second ring came. Unexpected, wrong according to all the legends. The bell never rang twice in one storm. Yet here it was. Another perfect note, but slightly different in pitch, creating a harmony with the still fading first note that made several people gasp. Father Tomas dropped his rosary. The landowners exchanged uncertain glances. Don Rodrigo's mouth opened and closed without sound. This wasn't following the script of centuries. The founder felt pieces clicking together in his mind. Two rings suggested a massive electrical buildup, more than usual. The storm was indeed stronger than typical, but there was something else. Those holes in the bell's crown, filled with resin, what if they weren't filled completely? What if moisture had penetrated, creating additional conductive paths? A third ring, harmonizing with the dying echoes of the first two, and now people were genuinely frightened. An old man fell to his knees, crying out about the end times. A serving girl fainted. Don Rodrigo tried to maintain control, shouting about testing of faith, but his voice cracked with uncertainty. "We should go to the chapel," the founder announced, loud enough for all to hear. "If heaven speaks unusually, we should listen closely." It was a risk, but calculated. People needed action when faced with the inexplicable. Don Rodrigo couldn't refuse without seeming impious, and the founder needed to examine the bell while it was still charged with whatever forces the storm had awakened. A group formed. Himself, Don Rodrigo, Father Tomas, Miguel, and surprisingly, Doña Isabel, who ignored her brother's protests about feminine delicacy. They took lanterns and ventured into the storm, though the rain had lessened to a steady drizzle. The chapel air crackled with residual energy. The founder could feel it in his teeth, his bones. The bell hung motionless, but around it that blue glow persisted, fading slowly like sunset. "Mother of God!" Father Tomas breathed, staring at the luminous bronze. The founder approached carefully, noting that the metal filings Miguel had mentioned were indeed standing vertical, arranged in patterns that suggested magnetic fields of incredible complexity. The bell itself was warm to the touch, though not uncomfortably so. "Look at this," Miguel called from the corner. He'd found one of the copper rods the founder had noticed evidence of earlier, not buried but hidden behind loose stones. It ran from near the bell tower deep into the earth, and its surface showed recent scoring from electrical discharge. "Someone knew," Dona Isabel said quietly. "Someone understood what this bell could do and tried to enhance it." Don Rodrigo stood apart, his face cycling through emotions: confusion, anger, fear, and finally a kind of desperate calculation. "3 rings," he said slowly. "Surely this makes the miracle even greater." But the founder was examining the bell's crack with new understanding. The pattern wasn't random or even simply serpentine. It was mathematical, following a spiral that would distribute vibration in specific ways. The Flemish master hadn't just cast a bell. He'd created an instrument designed to sing with lightning itself. "The storm is passing," Father Tomas observed, and indeed, the thunder was moving away, the rain gentling to mist. They stood in the damaged chapel, each processing what they'd witnessed in their own way. Don Rodrigo saw his political opportunity complicated, but not necessarily lost. Father Tomas grappled with faith and physics, intertwining in ways his seminary training hadn't prepared him for. Miguel's eyes shone with the excitement of discovery. Doña Isabel watched her brother with an expression of sad understanding. And the founder? He looked at the bell, this magnificent, mysterious creation, and felt the deep satisfaction of approaching understanding. Not complete comprehension, not yet, but the outline of truth beginning to emerge from shadows of superstition. The bell had sung its storm song, and in doing so, had changed everything. The morning after the triple ringing found the estate in subdued chaos. Servants whispered in corners, crossing themselves whenever thunder was mentioned. The visiting landowners had departed at first light, their certainty about divine endorsement shaken by the unprecedented event. Don Rodrigo kept to his study, and through the door, the founder could hear heated correspondence being dictated to secretaries. Lucia found him in the estate's library, where he'd been searching for any records about modifications to the chapel. She carried a worn leather journal, handling it like a relic. "My father's last journal," she said, placing it carefully on the reading table. "From 1798, the year of the lightning strike. I thought it lost, but after last night, I remembered he sometimes hid important documents in the old dovecote." The founder opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed but intact, filled with the meticulous handwriting he'd come to recognize. The entries from spring of that year seemed routine: accounts, weather observations, notes about crop yields. Then, in late June, the tone changed. "The 23rd of June. Francisco grows increasingly strange. I found him in the chapel at dawn, pressing copper coins against the bell and listening to some sound only he claims to hear. He speaks of dreams where the bell teaches him songs in a language that predates words. The founder read on, absorbing the careful documentation of a tragedy foretold. Francisco, the bell ringer, had become obsessed with the bell's properties. He'd installed copper rods around the chapel, not to ground lightning, but to attract it, believing he could somehow commune with heavenly forces through the medium of struck bronze. The 1st of July. I've discovered Francisco's modifications to the chapel. Copper rods hidden in the walls, strange symbols carved into the bell frame. When confronted, he claimed the bell itself instructed him, that it was incomplete and needed these additions to fulfill its purpose. I've resolved to remove them tomorrow. But tomorrow never came for that intervention. The entry for July 3rd was in a different hand, shaky, emotional. Francisco is dead. The storm came suddenly, and he rushed to the chapel despite all warnings. The lightning strike was witnessed by many, a single massive bolt that turned night to day. We found him fused to the bell rope, his copper rings melted into his flesh. Yet the bell rang once, purely, as if his death had been its intention all along. Lucia pointed to a folded paper tucked between pages. The founder carefully extracted it, a diagram showing the positions of Francisco's copper rods, annotated in what looked like a blend of astronomical and alchemical symbols. "There's more," she said, turning to later pages. "After Francisco's death, my father tried to understand what had happened." The entries became increasingly technical. Lucia's father had corresponded with natural philosophers in Madrid and Oviedo, sharing observations about electrical phenomena. One passage stood out. Professor Mendez writes that the French scientist Coulomb has proven electrical fluid follows predictable laws. If Francisco's modifications turned the chapel into what Mendez calls an electrical accumulator, then the bells ringing during storms becomes explicable through natural philosophy rather than divine intervention. "Your father was remarkably forward-thinking," the founder observed. "Too forward." Don Rodrigo's father discovered these investigations and ordered them stopped. He said it was dangerous to question God's mysteries. Lucia's voice carried old bitterness. Father complied publicly, but continued his observations in secret. Miguel burst through the library door, face flushed with excitement and exertion. "Señor, you need to see this! I found something in the chapel foundations!" They followed him through the estate grounds, where work had resumed with forced normalcy. The chapel looked different in daylight, less ominous, more melancholy, like an old soldier showing his scars. Miguel led them to the chapel's rear, where he'd been reinforcing the foundation at Don Rodrigo's orders. A section of stone had collapsed inward, revealing a cavity behind. "I was mortaring the cracks when this gave way," he explained, holding his lantern into the space. "Look, there's a chamber back there." The founder examined the opening. It wasn't accidental. The stones had been deliberately placed to create a hidden space. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, were documents and strange instruments. They carefully extracted the cache. The instruments were curious: copper rods twisted into specific shapes, glass vessels with metallic residues, and what appeared to be a primitive electrical measurement device. The documents were in multiple hands, spanning decades. The oldest was dated 1622, a year after the bell's installation. Written in Flemish and signed by Jan van der Hoeven himself, it appeared to be instructions, though the founder's Flemish was limited. Lucia, however, surprised him again. "I can read some of this. French and Flemish share roots." She studied the text carefully. "He's describing the bell's special properties. The alloy contains silver and... I think this word means antimony." He says the crack wasn't damage, but design, created deliberately using thermal shock to achieve precise acoustical properties. Father Tomas had joined them, moving slowly but drawn by irresistible curiosity. Deliberately cracked? But why? The founder was beginning to understand. A perfect bell rings with many overtones. A cracked bell, normally, is dead. But a precisely cracked bell, with the right alloy and shape, becomes something else. A resonating chamber sensitive to electrical discharge. The Flemish master was creating an electrical instrument disguised as a bell, Doña Isabel said. She'd appeared silently, as was her way. In 1621, such knowledge would have been considered witchcraft. They continued examining the cache. There were letters between various keepers of the secret, bell ringers, estate managers, even a bishop who'd tried to understand rather than suppress the phenomenon. Each had added their observations, creating an accumulated wisdom about the bell's properties. One letter, dated 1740, was particularly revealing. The writer, a Jesuit priest with interests in natural philosophy, had conducted experiments during storms. He discovered that the bell's ringing could be influenced by the placement of metallic objects nearby, enhanced or suppressed depending on the configuration. Francisco knew all this, the founder said, understanding dawning. He wasn't mad. He was trying to complete what the Flemish master started. These copper rods, these positions, they're designed to maximize the bell's electrical sensitivity. But it killed him, Father Tomas protested, because he got too close during the discharge. He understood the principle, but not the danger. Miguel had been sketching the rod positions from the diagram. If we replace these safely, with proper grounding, we could control when and how the bell rings? Theoretically, yes, but absolutely not. Don Rodrigo's voice cut through their discussion. He stood in the chapel entrance, face dark with anger. I've tolerated this investigation, but I won't have you destroying the miracle that has protected this estate for centuries. Behind him stood the local magistrate and several men-at-arms. The founder realized they'd been so absorbed in discovery that they'd missed the approaching party. My lord, Father Tomas began, but Don Rodrigo cut him off. These documents will be secured. The bell will remain untouched. And you, he pointed at the founder, will complete your original commission and leave. The magistrate agrees that investigating divine mysteries borders on heresy. The magistrate, a thin man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, nodded reluctantly. The civil authorities support the maintenance of public order and faith. Doña Isabel stepped forward. Rodrigo, you cannot suppress truth because it inconveniences your plans. I can and I will. This bell has rang for our family for 2 centuries. I won't have it reduced to mere mechanism by wandering craftsmen and curious servants. The tension stretched taut as a bell rope. The founder saw Lucia clutch her father's journal tighter, Miguel's hand drift toward his hammer, Father Tomas's lips moving in what might have been prayer or calculation. The founder spent the next 3 days under subtle house arrest, permitted to continue his work on the village bells, but accompanied always by one of the magistrate's men. Yet confinement sharpened his mind rather than dulling it. Each evening he conducted quiet experiments in his room, using copper wire purchased from Miguel and glass vessels borrowed from the kitchen. The principle was becoming clear. Static electrical charge accumulated in the atmosphere during storms, and the bell, with its unique composition and form, acted as a massive capacitor. The crack created the resonating chamber, while the silver and antimony in the alloy enhanced conductivity. When discharge occurred, the entire bell vibrated at a frequency that produced that distinctive, sustained note. On the fourth morning, Father Tomas visited him, officially to hear confession, but actually to share revelations of his own. "I've prayed extensively on this matter," the old priest began, settling his aged bones into a chair. "And I've reached certain conclusions that might interest you." The founder waited, knowing that Spanish priests often possessed surprising depths of reasoning beneath their orthodox surfaces. "Consider Moses and the burning bush. The bush burned but was not consumed. Modern travelers to Sinai report seeing bushes that appear to burn in certain lights, a trick of oils in the leaves and desert sun. Does knowing the mechanism diminish the miracle? Or does it perhaps enhance our appreciation of a God who speaks through natural law?" It was a sophisticated theological argument, one that wouldn't have been out of place in the universities of Salamanca or Paris. The founder nodded slowly. "The bell rings through natural principles, yes," Father Tomas continued. "But who designed those principles? Who arranged that bronze and lightning should sing together?" Perhaps the true miracle isn't the violation of natural law, but its elegant application. Through the window they could see Lucia teaching a group of village children their letters in the garden, using sticks to draw in the dirt. Don Rodrigo tolerated it because their parents were his tenants, but his disapproval was evident in his absence. "She's remarkable," Father Tomas observed. "Her father would be proud. Did you know he once considered sending her to the convent school in Oviedo? Not for religious vocation, but for education. Don Rodrigo's father forbade it." "Knowledge confined becomes knowledge corrupted," the founder said, thinking of all the suppressed understanding about the bell. "Indeed, which is why I've made certain decisions." The priest pulled out a sealed letter. "This is for the bishop. It contains my complete testimony about the bell's nature, based on your investigations and my own observations." "I won't send it yet, but if Don Rodrigo attempts to use the bell's miracle for unjust purposes, the Church will know the truth." It was a brave stance for a rural priest dependent on noble patronage. The founder felt respect for the old man deepen. That afternoon, Doña Isabel requested his presence in the estate's small laboratory. Yes, the estate had such a room, though Don Rodrigo preferred to ignore its existence. She dissembled an impressive array of equipment: Leyden jars, copper coils, and books in French and German. "My late husband collected these," she explained. "He believed Spain's future lay in embracing natural philosophy rather than clinging to medieval mysteries. I've continued his experiments in my own modest way." She demonstrated a small-scale version of what the founder had theorized, a cracked bronze disc that, when subjected to electrical discharge from a Leyden jar, produced a clear, ringing tone without being struck. "Remarkable," he breathed, watching the disc vibrate. "The principle scales perfectly. Your bell is simply a massive version of this effect. But here's what interests me more." She adjusted the configuration, adding small copper rods around the disc. "Watch how the tone changes based on the rod placement." Indeed, the same discharge now produced a different pitch, a warmer quality. The founder immediately grasped the implications. Francisco hadn't been trying to merely enhance the bell's sensitivity. He'd been attempting to tune it, to control what notes it could produce. "Your brother won't accept this knowledge easily," the founder warned. "My brother is facing pressure from multiple directions. The villagers grow restless about the land disputes. The bishop questions the convenient timing of miracles. And now the government in Madrid speaks of surveying all noble lands for potential railway routes. She smiled grimly. Rodrigo's medieval world is ending, whether he accepts it or not. Miguel arrived, ostensibly to repair a window latch, but actually to report. Don Rodrigo has sent for more witnesses, priests from 3 parishes, the provincial governor's secretary. He plans a great demonstration during the next storm. When? Tomorrow night, if the weather holds. The farmers say another storm approaches from the sea. The founder exchanged glances with Doña Isabel. They had perhaps 24 hours to prevent Don Rodrigo from using false miracle for real injustice. That evening, the founder found himself alone with the bell one last time. The magistrate's guards had grown lax, and he'd slipped out through the servants' quarters. The chapel was silver-washed in moonlight, the bell hanging silent and secret in its tower. He climbed to the bell chamber and placed his hands on the bronze, feeling its cool surface, the minute imperfections that made it unique. In his years of casting bells, he'd learned that each one had its own voice, its own personality. This one had been given an extraordinary gift, or curse, by its Flemish creator, the ability to sing with heaven's own fire. The founder thought about all the people who'd been drawn to this bell over the centuries, the Flemish master who'd encoded secret knowledge in bronze, Francisco who'd died trying to complete the design, Lucia's father who'd documented its mysteries, and now himself, a simple craftsman caught between science and faith, truth and power. A footstep on the stairs made him turn. Lucia stood there, carrying a lantern that painted golden shadows across her face. "I knew you'd come here," she said softly. "It draws us all eventually." "Your father understood that." "He understood many things, too many for his own peace." She approached the bell, running her fingers along its decorated surface. "Do you know what I think?" "I think the Flemish master was himself torn between worlds. He created something that could prove the existence of natural electrical forces, but disguised it as a religious object. He was protecting dangerous knowledge while ensuring it survived." The founder considered this. It fit with what they'd discovered: the hidden documents, the encoded symbols, the careful preservation of technique across generations. Tomorrow, Don Rodrigo will try to use this bell to justify taking the common lands. The villagers will lose their grazing rights, their water access. Some will starve come winter. Unless the bell doesn't perform as expected. She looked at him sharply. "You have a plan?" "I have knowledge. Whether I have the courage to use it remains to be seen." They stood in companionable silence, 2 people who understood that truth carried its own responsibilities. Below them, the estate slept, unaware that its ordered world balanced on the edge of change. "My father wrote once that God's greatest gift to humanity wasn't faith, but curiosity," Lucia said finally. "The desire to understand creation, not simply accept it." The founder thought of his own son back in Santander, eager to learn not just the craft of bell-making, but the principles behind it. The world was changing, yes, but perhaps that change could be guided by wisdom rather than driven by ignorance. The storm built throughout the day like a slow argument between earth and sky. By late afternoon, the air had taken on that peculiar weight that pressed against the skin, and animals grew restless in their stalls. The founder watched from his window as carriages arrived bearing Don Rodrigo's witnesses, 3 parish priests, 2 provincial administrators, and several landowners who stood to benefit from the proposed land redistribution. The estate transformed into a theater of anticipation. Servants arranged chairs in the great hall facing the windows that overlooked the chapel. Don Rodrigo, dressed in his finest black velvet, moved among his guests with the controlled energy of a man about to play his greatest card. The founder had made his decision in the gray hours before dawn. Now, as evening approached, he requested a private audience with Don Rodrigo. The magistrate's guard escorted him to the study where the nobleman reviewed documents with his secretary. "You wish to speak?" Don Rodrigo's tone suggested this was an unwelcome interruption. "I wish to demonstrate something, my lord. About the bell." "The bell requires no demonstration beyond what heaven provides." "But what if heaven's provision could be understood and even predicted?" The founder pulled out his journal, opened to pages of careful diagrams. "What if I could show you exactly why and how the bell rings?" Don Rodrigo's eyes narrowed. "You speak of heresy." "I speak of natural philosophy. The same forces that create lightning create the bell's voice." "Observe." The founder had brought his small experimental apparatus, a Leyden jar, copper wire, and a small cracked bronze disc. With careful movements, he charged the jar using silk and glass, then discharged it near the disc. The bronze sang out clear and pure without being touched. The secretary gasped and crossed himself. Don Rodrigo stood frozen, his face cycling through expressions like weather across mountains, disbelief, anger, fear, and finally a cold calculation. "You claim our bell operates on this principle?" "The bell is a masterwork of both faith and science. The Flemish master who cast it understood electrical properties that we're only now rediscovering. Each time it rings, it's not divine intervention, but divine design. God's natural laws playing out exactly as he intended." "And you can prove this?" The founder chose his words carefully. "I can demonstrate that the bell rings due to electrical discharge during storms." Whether that discharge is guided by providence or probability is a theological question beyond my expertise. Don Rodrigo walked to the window, staring at the chapel where already servants were lighting torches against the gathering dark. His guests would assemble soon, expecting miracles. If this knowledge became public, it would destroy 2 centuries of tradition, or transform it into something greater, an appreciation for the elegance of creation's design. "You don't understand nobility, founder. We rule not through strength alone, but through mystery, through the assumption that we possess some divine sanction. Take that away." He turned, and his face showed genuine fear beneath the aristocratic mask. "The Carlists nearly tore Spain apart. The liberals speak of republics and democracy. If even our miracles prove mechanical, what authority remains?" The founder felt unexpected sympathy for this man caught between worlds. Perhaps the authority of wisdom rather than mystery. "Your sister manages her estates through education and innovation, yet her tenants prosper and respect her. Isabel has always been too modern for her own good." But there was affection in the complaint. Don Rodrigo returned to his desk, fingers drumming on the wood. "What do you propose?" "Let tonight proceed as planned. The bell will likely ring. The atmospheric conditions are perfect. But afterward, instead of using it to justify taking lands, propose a different interpretation. The bell rings to call for unity, for cooperation between nobility and commons. Establish schools, improve irrigation, modernize farming methods. lead through progress rather than tradition. And if I refuse, then others will reveal the truth less kindly. Father Tomas has written to the bishop. Your sister has contacted natural philosophers in Madrid. The secret is already escaping your control. Don Rodrigo's laugh was bitter. So my choice is to surrender gracefully or be overthrown disgracefully. Your choice is to be remembered as a wise lord who embraced change or a foolish one who was crushed by it. Before Don Rodrigo could respond, Doña Isabel entered without knocking, followed by Father Tomas and, surprisingly, Lucia. "Rodrigo," Isabel said firmly, "we need to discuss tonight." "This is a conspiracy." "This is a family trying to save you from yourself," she replied. "The founder has shown you the science. Father Tomas can speak to the theology. Lucia knows the estate's needs better than anyone. Listen to us." The old priest stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "My lord, I've served this estate for 30 years. I've seen the bell ring dozens of times. Each time it brought not commands but comfort, not division but unity. Perhaps that's the true miracle, not the mechanism, but the meaning we choose to find." Lucia added quietly, "The villagers don't need to lose their lands, my lord. They need to learn better farming methods. I've been teaching their children to read. With education, they could triple their yields. Your prosperity and theirs need not be opposed." The founder watched Don Rodrigo wrestle with decades of assumption and privilege. Outside, thunder rumbled closer, and the first fat raindrops began to fall. "The guests are assembling," the secretary announced nervously. Don Rodrigo stood slowly, aged by the weight of decision. "Very well. Tonight the bell will ring, as it always has. But what I say afterward," he looked at each of them in turn, "that remains to be seen." They filed out toward the great hall, where anticipation crackled as palpably as the lightning beginning to flash outside. The founder caught Miguel's eye. The young blacksmith had positioned himself near the windows, ready for whatever might come. The assembly quieted as Don Rodrigo took his position before them. Through the windows, the chapel was visible, its bell tower stark against the roiling sky. The storm was building to its climax, and everyone could feel it. That metallic taste in the air, that sense of standing at the threshold of something momentous. "Honored guests," Don Rodrigo began, his voice carrying the authority of generations. "Tonight you will witness what my family has guarded for 2 centuries. The voice of heaven itself, speaking through bronze and storm." Lightning forked across the sky, impossibly bright, and thunder followed like the earth itself groaning. The founder watched the bell tower begin to glow with that eerie blue light, St. Elmo's fire dancing along its edges. Any moment now. The charge was building, seeking ground, and the bell stood ready to sing its ancient song. But what message would Don Rodrigo draw from that voice? The founder had presented truth and argument, but ultimately, the choice belonged to the man who held power. The air itself seemed to pause, holding its breath. Then, with a flash that turned night to day, lightning struck near the chapel. The bell rang out, its voice pure and otherworldly, carrying across the valley like a judgment or a blessing, depending on who listened. Don Rodrigo stood transfixed, his face unreadable in the flickering light. The note held, sustained beyond natural possibility, and in that moment, the founder saw the nobleman make his choice. The bell's note faded into the storm's fury, leaving behind a silence that seemed louder than thunder. Don Rodrigo stood before his assembled witnesses, his face transformed by something between revelation and resignation. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a different authority than before, less commanding, more contemplative. "The bell has spoken," he said slowly. "But perhaps we have been misunderstanding its language for generations." The visiting priests exchanged uncertain glances. One of the landowners, Don Carlos, stepped forward. "Surely the meaning is clear. Heaven endorses our rightful claims." "Does it?" Don Rodrigo interrupted. "Or does heaven remind us that some forces are greater than our petty disputes?" He gestured toward the window where lightning continued to illuminate the chapel. "I have been shown something tonight. The bell rings not through simple miracle, but through God's elegant design of natural law. It is no less wondrous for being comprehensible." Gasps rippled through the assembly. Father Tomas moved to support Don Rodrigo's unexpected confession, his aged voice carrying surprising strength. "As it is written, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Understanding creation's mechanisms deepens rather than diminishes our awe." The founder watched this unfold with mixed relief and concern. Don Rodrigo was choosing truth, but managing its revelation required delicacy. Too much too fast, and the social fabric could tear. "What are you saying?" Don Carlos demanded. "That the bell is some sort of trick?" "Not a trick, a teaching," Doña Isabel interjected smoothly. "For 2 centuries, this bell has reminded us that heaven touches earth through natural phenomena. Lightning and bronze sing together according to principles that philosophers are only now beginning to understand." Don Rodrigo raised his hand for silence. "Tomorrow I will demonstrate what has been discovered. But tonight, let us consider what the bell truly asks of us. It rings during storms, times of turbulence and change. Perhaps its message is not about maintaining old orders, but about adapting to new realities." The founder noticed Lucia slip quietly from the room. Through the window, he saw her heading toward the chapel with several servants carrying equipment, preparing for tomorrow's demonstration, he realized. The girl thought ahead. The gathering dissolved into heated discussion. Some priests argued theology, others whispered about heresy. The landowners seemed primarily concerned with their political plans, now thrown into uncertainty. Don Rodrigo moved among them, no longer proclaiming but conversing, a remarkable transformation for a man accustomed to unquestioned authority. Miguel approached the founder discreetly. "Señor, Lucia asks for your assistance. She has an idea about the bell." They made their way through the rain to the chapel, where Lucia had assembled an interesting collection: copper rods, wire, and most surprisingly, a new bell rope woven with copper thread. "If we're to demonstrate the principle tomorrow, we need to make it safe," she explained. "Francisco died because he was the ground for the electrical discharge. But what if we provide a better path?" The founder immediately grasped her intention. Working through the night, they installed a proper grounding system: copper rods that would channel electrical discharge safely to earth, away from anyone who might be near the bell. The copper-threaded rope would conduct enough charge to demonstrate the principle, but not enough to harm. As dawn approached, they stood back to survey their work. The modifications were subtle, almost invisible unless one knew where to look. The bell remained magnificent in its ancient mystery, but now safely harnessed. "Your father would be proud," the founder told Lucia. "He would be relieved," she corrected. "He always feared someone else would die trying to understand the bell's secret." The morning brought unexpected visitors, a delegation of villagers led by the eldest farmer, a weathered man named Tomas the Elder, to distinguish him from the priest. They'd heard rumors of the previous night's revelations and came seeking truth. Don Rodrigo received them in the courtyard, a break with protocol that would have been unthinkable days ago. "You've come about the bell," he said simply. "We've come about our lands," Tomas the Elder replied with equal directness. "If the bell's miracle is now questioned, the bell's miracle is confirmed, but its nature is clarified," Don Rodrigo interrupted. "Let me show you something." The demonstration took place at midday, with the entire estate and half the surrounding countryside in attendance. The founder, assisted by Miguel and supervised by Doña Isabel, had constructed a larger version of his experimental apparatus. Using a Leyden jar charged to capacity, he showed how electrical discharge could make bronze sing without touch. Then, boldly, he connected the apparatus to the actual bell through the new copper-threaded rope. The discharge was small, controlled, but sufficient. The great bell emitted a soft, clear note that carried across the silent crowd. "This is the principle," the founder explained. "During storms, lightning creates the same effect, but with tremendous power. The bell was designed by a master who understood these forces centuries before science could explain them." Some in the crowd looked disappointed, as if a precious mystery had been stolen. Others seemed relieved, freed from the weight of supernatural expectation. But most appeared thoughtful, processing this shift in understanding. Don Rodrigo stepped forward. "For generations, my family has interpreted the bell's voice as endorsing our authority. We were wrong. The bell speaks of forces beyond human control, of laws that govern noble and commoner alike. In recognizing this, I propose something new." He outlined a plan that must have cost him considerable pride to conceive. The disputed lands would remain common, but with improved management. The estate would provide education and tools for better farming. In return, a portion of increased yields would support these improvements. It was not charity, but investment. Not surrender, but adaptation. Tomas the Elder considered this carefully, then nodded. "The bell has always rung for the entire valley, not just the castle. Perhaps it's fitting that its true nature brings benefit to all." Father Tomas offered to consecrate the bell anew, not as a mystery, but as a reminder of creation's elegant complexity. The ceremony was simple but moving, acknowledging both faith and reason. As the crowd dispersed, the founder began his final task, documenting everything for future generations. Working with Lucia, they created a comprehensive record of the bell's design, function, and history. This would be kept in both the estate's archives and the monastery, ensuring the knowledge couldn't be lost or suppressed again. "Will you recast it?" Don Rodrigo asked, finding the founder in the chapel that evening. "Create a normal bell that won't cause such controversy." The founder considered the bell, glowing golden in the sunset light streaming through the broken roof. "No, my lord. This bell is unique, a masterwork that bridges ages and understandings. But I will cast you a new bell for regular use, one that human hands can ring for human purposes. Let this one remain special, ringing only when nature wills it, reminding us that some things remain beyond our complete control." Don Rodrigo nodded slowly. Perhaps that's wisdom. We've spent so long trying to control the miraculous that we forgot to appreciate the genuinely marvelous. That night, as the founder prepared his equipment for creating the new bell, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. He'd come to inspect bells and found himself inspecting the very nature of faith, knowledge, and social change. Miguel worked beside him, eager to learn the ancient craft of bell founding. "Do you think," the young man asked, "that other mysteries might yield to investigation? Other miracles that might prove to be natural phenomena we don't yet understand?" "Almost certainly," the founder replied, checking the quality of bronze ingots they'd procured. "But remember, understanding how something works doesn't diminish its wonder. The sun is no less magnificent for our knowing it's a sphere of burning gas rather than Apollo's chariot." They worked in companionable silence, preparing molds and measuring materials. Tomorrow they would begin casting a new bell, one designed for human hands and daily use, carrying no burden of mystery beyond the ancient mystery of bronze transformed by fire into voice. 3 months had passed since the founder's departure from the Mendoza estate, 3 months of ordinary work that felt somehow insufficient after the extraordinary events of early summer. He'd returned to Santander, to his workshop that smelled of coal and bronze, to the familiar rhythm of commissions and castings. Yet his mind often wandered to those Asturian mountains, wondering how the seeds of change he'd helped plant were growing. The letter from Doña Isabel arrived on a morning when autumn mist rolled in from the Cantabrian Sea, making the world seem soft and indefinite. She wrote that the new bell was ready for consecration, and that his presence was specifically requested, not commanded, she emphasized, but genuinely desired. The journey back felt different. The same mountain paths seemed somehow lighter, less burdened with hidden tensions. When he stopped at the inn where he'd once met Joaquin, the innkeeper spoke excitedly of changes in the valley: a new school, improved irrigation channels, the railway company surveying for a possible spur line. He arrived at the estate just as the setting sun painted the mountains gold and purple. The first thing he noticed was the chapel, no longer partially ruined, but restored, its roof rebuilt with slate that caught the light like water. The bell tower stood proud against the sky, and within it he could see both bells, the ancient mystery and the new voice he'd helped create. Lucia met him at the gate, and he barely recognized her. She wore a simple but well-cut dress, more suited to a teacher than a housekeeper, and ink stains on her fingers had become a badge of pride rather than something to hide. "Welcome back, Master Founder. You'll find much changed." Indeed, the estate buzzed with different energy. In what had been ornamental gardens, vegetable plots now grew, tended by village children learning practical agriculture alongside their letters. The old dovecote had been converted into a classroom where Lucia taught 20 pupils of various ages. Don Rodrigo greeted him with genuine warmth, the stiffness of noble condescension replaced by something more authentic. "Your bell has served us well," he said, leading the founder to the chapel. "It rings every morning and evening, calling the community together, not through mystery, but through simple beauty." The new bell was bronze perfection, its surface decorated with images telling the estate's story, not just noble heraldry, but scenes of farmers, craftsmen, the valley's daily life. When struck, it produced a warm, golden tone that seemed to embrace rather than command. "And the old bell?" the founder asked. "Still speaks during storms, though less frequently now that we've properly grounded it. When it does ring, people pause and appreciate the natural wonder, then return to their work. Mystery has become appreciation. That evening, the entire community gathered for a harvest feast in the Great Hall, another unprecedented mixing of classes. The founder found himself seated between Father Tomas and Miguel, who proudly described his new workshop where he was experimenting with improved plow designs.
"I'm thinking of studying in Madrid," Miguel confided. "Doña Isabel has offered patronage. She says Spain needs engineers who understand both traditional craft and modern science." Father Tomas, frailer than 3 months ago but with eyes still bright, added his own news. "The bishop was most interested in our situation. He's commissioned a study of other miraculous phenomena to see what might be explained through natural philosophy. Not to diminish faith, but to prevent its exploitation." As the evening progressed, the founder noticed how the community had reorganized itself around shared purpose rather than rigid hierarchy. Don Rodrigo still held authority, but it was authority earned through wisdom rather than assumed through birth. Later, unable to sleep, the founder walked to the chapel alone. Both bells hung silent in the tower, the old and the new, mystery and craft side by side. He climbed the stairs one more time, his hand trailing along stones worn smooth by centuries of passage. The moon was full, silvering everything with soft light. He could see the entire valley spread below, the estate, the villages, the fields ready for harvest, the mountains standing eternal guard. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, and another answered. He thought about his son back in Santander, eager to learn not just bell founding, but the principles behind it. The boy had written excitedly about books arriving from Paris, about new techniques and possibilities. The craft would continue, but transformed, just as this valley had transformed. A hand on his shoulder made him turn. Lucia stood there, wrapped in a shawl against the night's chill. "I wanted to thank you," she said simply. "Not for solving the bell's mystery, but for how you solved it, with respect for both truth and tradition."
"Your father began that work.
"I merely continued it."
She smiled, that clear expression he remembered. "Father once wrote that knowledge is like bronze. It must be alloyed with wisdom to become useful. You understood that." They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who had shared something profound, the transformation of mystery into understanding without losing wonder. Below, the estate slept peacefully, its conflicts resolved not through force or divine proclamation, but through the harder work of mutual comprehension. "I have something for you," Lucia said, producing a wrapped package. Inside was a journal, leather-bound and well-made. "For your observations. Father would have wanted you to have it." The founder accepted the gift, understanding its weight. These pages would hold not just technical notes, but the story of how knowledge and faith could coexist, how tradition and progress might dance together like bronze and lightning. A distant rumble of thunder made them both look toward the mountains.
Another storm was building, perhaps days away. When it arrived, the old bell might ring again, its voice carrying across the valley. But now people would hear it differently, not as command or miracle, but as reminder that the world held wonders still, waiting to be understood. "I should return to Santander soon," the founder said. "Other bells await, other mysteries perhaps." "But you'll come back for the consecration of the new school? Don Rodrigo is converting the East Wing, and we're commissioning a bell specifically for it." He smiled, already imagining that bell,
something that would call children to learning as naturally as the old bell had called lightning. The next morning, preparing to leave, the founder made one last visit to his bells. He struck the new one gently, listening to its voice carry across the valley, clean and true. The old bell he merely touched, feeling the ancient bronze cool under his palm, all its secrets revealed, but its dignity intact.
Don Rodrigo saw him off personally, shaking hands like equals rather than noble and craftsmen. "You've taught us something valuable," he said. "That understanding need not diminish reverence, that knowledge can deepen rather than destroy faith." As the founder's cart rolled away from the estate, he turned for one last look. The chapel stood clear against the morning sky, both bells visible in the tower. They would ring for generations more, one by human hand, one by nature's own force, reminding all who heard them that the world was full of wonders both understood and yet to be discovered. The road ahead led back to Santander, to his workshop and his son, to the ordinary magic of turning earth and fire into singing bronze. But he carried with him the extraordinary summer when he'd helped transform not just bells, but an entire community's understanding of the miraculous. The mountains watched his departure as they'd watched his arrival, ancient and patient, keeping their own secrets while clouds gathered on distant peaks, preparing for storms and songs yet to come. The founder smiled, feeling the journal's weight in his travel bag, its blank pages waiting to be filled with observations and wonders. Some mysteries, he'd learned, weren't meant to be solved, but transformed, from barriers to bridges, from chains to keys. The bell of San Isidro would ring through centuries more, its voice no less powerful for being understood, perhaps more so. For now, people knew they listened not to arbitrary divine commands, but to the elegant conversation between heaven and earth, conducted in the ancient language of bronze and lightning. The mule knew the way home, and the founder let the reins go slack, his mind already turning to future work, future wonders, future transformations of mystery into understanding.